Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying Simio Sync. My name is Daniel Pomerantz, and today I'm going to be talking about data mesh, a new mentality for enterprise data governance. Yes, we're talking about data governance, a topic that might sound boring, but I think is far, far from it. This topic is at the intersection of organizational strategy and business intelligence technology, and it's critical to understand how to build a business that treats data like gold and uses it in their everyday decision making. We're talking about becoming data driven, right? And to get there, we're going to first learn about the state of enterprise data and some critical context for this conversation. We're going to see some demonstrations of new technologies that are the foundation of this new strategic approach. We're going to have a conversation about the individual components of this data mesh mentality to grow an understanding of how each may or may not be something that you should really be thinking about with your data strategy. And I'll also talk a little bit about how the exponential growth in AI technology plays into all this. So that should get your attention, right? So who am I and why am I asking you to hear me out on this topic? I've been in enterprise systems and applications my entire career. I've been a part of large multinational corporate ERP implementations. I've seen smaller MES from an industry perspective. And I later joined Tulip as a part of their low-code services team, helping to deploy applications that sort of go against this typical large enterprise model. And along the way, I've learned a ton and thought a lot about these types of problems. And just this past year, I founded my own consulting company to bring some of my energy and expertise to businesses in the manufacturing and supply chain space. Most notably, at these two companies in particular, so with W.L. Gore, a manufacturer based in Maryland, I worked as a continuous improvement engineer at first and used a lot of Excel work and data, of course. But naturally, and out of my sort of energy on this topic, migrated towards a central data team. So I worked first as a data stakeholder and grew into someone who was helping others use data throughout the enterprise. And I got to see a lot of different perspectives there. And I did something similar at Tulip, but instead of being a, industry company with a lot of ERP data, with Tulip, it was a much smaller, more startup type company where I got to see this same level of complexity, but applied to very different structures of data. And along the way, I found problem statements like this incredibly frustrating and, in my opinion, solvable. Now, many of you listening will relate to probably all of the quotes on this screen. Data is always a nightmare to deal with, to get, to understand, and that doesn't need to be the case. So I'm here today to talk about data mesh. I think this is a really, really good step forward for everyone who works with data, which hopefully is everyone. But before we get into it, I want to just go over what data governance is. And I know this part's going to be a little boring, but I think it's important. Data governance is a principled approach to managing data during its life cycle from acquisition to use to disposal. And that's important because you have to think along the full life cycle of data to truly understand data governance. However, the predominant amount of users generally only work with data in these three central layers. And for today's conversation, since a majority of you are not strictly data governance stakeholders, you're more just data users, we're going to talk about these three and the interaction between them so that we can better understand how we are going to use data now and in the future. Data storage, step one. So the main thing to take away here is that systems are storing data live in some form of database, no matter what. So when you go into your ERP system and you are updating purchase orders, you are generally implementing or making changes to a live database connected to that ERP system. But a lot of reporting is going to be more focused on these data warehouses or data lakes. And what happens is, on some type of scheduled basis, data is replicated from these system databases into a central data store. Now, we don't need to get into warehouse, lakehouse, There's a lot of conversation there for another time, but the main thing I want to emphasize is that data is going from a system database to a central, more reporting designed database. And then also worth pointing out that there are a few other, more nuanced types of data storage. The historian is very common in manufacturing for capturing large amounts of continuous data. And document storage is obviously very important for businesses that keep track of a lot of PDFs or Word documents, right? That data is real. And honestly, data from whiteboards, Excel sheets, paper, that's all data that needs to be governed. So it should be considered as a part of this step. Next, data processing. This is what we'll probably talk about the most today. When we have data, we do a lot of different things to it to make it usable. And that's what this is about. So for performance reasons, you might aggregate data, but predominantly you are going to be transforming and manipulating data to combine different patterns and flows to give yourself what you specifically need. So that's the predominant conversation that we're going to be having today. Worth noting that during this processing step is also the ideal opportunity to start testing the quality of your data. So making sure that rows aren't getting doubled and making sure that your core tables always have some records in them, that kind of stuff. So lots of things happening here, but in the end, we're all mostly curious about data usage. And we'll talk about this. You generally want to work backwards from data usage, right? You want to think about what data do I need? What reports do I need? What automations need to fire off of data? And you're going to go backwards from there. But for today's sake, we're predominantly going to be talking about report viewing as like the simple example of how enterprises use data. But it's important to remember that especially as applications become more intertwined and enterprises become more advanced in their data usage, there are a lot of things that use data. And that is all the more reason to be a little bit more careful about your data governance. So let's talk about the data org. This is, again, a drastic oversimplification. The main thing I want to talk about here is this difference between a centralized data team and a decentralized data team, right? Everyone has probably thought about this in some capacity, and the main idea is that in this left side, the data team is entirely a shared resource from each of the green, maybe business units here. So maybe this is HR, accounting, supply chain, and they all go to a central team. And the opposite end is that each individual business unit has their own data team. And this is going to depend highly, probably from business unit to business unit, but definitely from organization to organization. And in reality, almost every business is some type of hybrid here. And this is the crux of what we're talking about today, right? On the left, you have your different business units that need all sorts of different data. And on the right, you have different data professionals that have amazing skills that are so crucial to making data work for an enterprise. But how do we get them to work together? Because a lot of time, things look like this, right? The business always needs more. They always need something different because they're dealing with a wide variety of problems. And the data team is usually over capacity and unsure really what's going on at these, spokes of their wheel. So we see some conflicts like this. Obviously, people are always civil. I'm not saying that these teams are really entering into conflict with each other, but these quotes represent the struggle that leads to poor decision making when it comes to data. And this happens, right? The business can't get the help they need, or the help that they're getting isn't quite, capable of understanding what they need. And they're like, screw it, we'll do it in Excel. And the data teams typically end up spending time in inefficient places because they're just trying to do what they think is best, but they don't have the visibility to all of the business problems that could be solved with data. And that is the perfect segue to our goal, right? At the end of this conversation, we want to have an idea of what it looks like to build this data-driven organization. And I think that the data mesh is a really good place to start. So it's worth pointing out, data mesh is a relatively known concept in the data community. It's been around since 2019 and has grown in popularity for being a pretty good set of ideas. There's an online community dedicated to teaching and sharing the ideas here. There's also one of these books. So there's a ton of great content explaining the depths of what data mesh is really about, as well as examples of how it's being used in businesses today. So I've put my own sort of simplified definition of what I think data mesh is, and I'm going to elaborate on this, of course, but I think it's a set of cultural and architectural principles that work together to set up an organization for efficient, secure, and sustainable, emphasis on sustainable, data-driven decision-making. Data mesh is not an individual or set of software platforms. It's not a data strategy. It's not a specific form of data storage. It's not just technology, and it's not just culture. It's the combination of the two used in a certain way. And it's also up to you to define what it really means for your business, right? At the end of the day, it's usually a marketing tool. Every business has some components of data mesh already being used and some components that they're bad at. And my goal today is to teach you about data mesh, about why these concepts are so popular right now, and let you decide which of them is important for you so that you can build your own data mesh or data, whatever you want to call it. So let's look at the pillars of data mesh. These are a well-established and agreed upon, 4 tenets of data mesh. To start, we're going to go with domain-oriented decentralization. And this builds upon a lot of emphasis and complaints around people owning things that they don't quite understand. So the main idea here is you are decentralizing the ownership of data, meaning for all of these business units that I have listed out, they need to start taking more ownership of their data. Now, most organizations, of course, these business units own some of their data or they own it in some capacity. But a key tenet of data mesh is shifting the ownership and responsibility of data into the business unit's hands. Sounds pretty good for IT, right? The next step, treating data as a product. So again, we're putting more responsibility in the hands of the business units, but we need to do this to properly create and manage good data. As a part of that, these business units need to start treating data as a product, meaning the data that I capture on my manufacturing floor has to be correct and documented so that others, maybe in accounting, want and are able to use it. So each business unit becomes responsible for maintaining high quality and well-documented data. And the hope is that this is something that you kind of help others and they help you, right? If accounting starts providing manufacturing with better data, manufacturing starts providing accounting with better data, everyone's a little bit happier. Now, a core component of this is the technology involved. And that's why an entire tenet is dedicated to a self-serve data infrastructure platform. Now, those words were chosen carefully, I imagine, because there's an emphasis on anyone being able to go into this platform and understand, access, and add to the data that's available in their enterprise. Now, at first, this sounds kind of scary because you're saying, everyone's going to go in and access all the data. That sounds like a security risk. But in actuality, when you centralize, which is a theme we're going to keep talking about, we're going to centralize the data infrastructure. It's now just one place that you need to control access. And obviously, these types of tools need to have robust security and controls functionality. So again, It sounds a little scary saying, let's put all our data in one place and give everyone access to it. No, in practice, you're giving everyone controlled access to the data that they have the need to have, or maybe the want to have in some cases. But for your tighter data, you now only need to control it in one location. And this kind of brings us to the fourth and probably underappreciated component of data mesh, right? A lot of people talk about democratize. The key to data mesh is that there's a central team orchestrating and maintaining the cleanliness of all this. And it's extremely important to get this right. I've noted here, especially early on, right? You're never going to have this, light bulb moment and have your whole organization start thinking in a data mesh. So this central team is going to have a lot of responsibility early on as you start to shift the way that your organization thinks about data. And even long term, as the organization becomes more comfortable with this, the central data team is still a necessity for maintaining best practices, providing advanced data resources, and working in combination with the business to help the business units work together and work maybe even with themselves. So that's like kind of the philosophy of data mesh. And now I want to start to demonstrate a little bit about number 3, right? I think by seeing some practical examples of data mesh, we'll start to understand how this future is like really possible. So let's start with these steps in our data process, right? In order to use data, we first need to capture it. And I'm going to bounce over to our first key demo. And this is about the concept of ETL versus ELT. These are acronyms. You may have heard of ETL before, just so everyone's on the same page. ETL is extract, transform, load. It's an industry standard terminology that's been around for decades, and it basically means we are getting data from A to B. We are ETLing from A to B. It's been used ubiquitously in the industry for many, many years, but all of a sudden, over the past maybe 5 years, everyone has started talking about ELT. And so this is a quick screen cap I grabbed from Google. You can see every single data company trying to get in on this SEO opportunity, and ETL versus ELT, ETL versus ELT. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll demonstrate for you. The main idea is that in the past and currently, a lot of applications extract data, transform it as a part of their data pipeline, and then load it into a central data store. And this new mentality is just about extracting a bunch of raw, perhaps unorganized data, putting it into a data warehouse, and transforming it there. So that's the slight difference that the entire industry is shifting towards. And we're going to see a little bit about why that is. So many of you will be familiar with spreadsheets like this one, where every month someone is required to follow these instructions to arrange certain data exports into a certain format to get a desired output. In this case, we require some Excel transformation to calculate our inputs to Simio. Simio requires, in our oversimplified scenario, 2 distinct columns to understand the route times of our unique steps. And in order to get that, we have to go to different places to get all of this data together. This is because when our MES system was originally put in place, we followed an ETL mentality. So the raw data is available directly from the MES system. And there's one report which is aggregated into the data warehouse. So in order to get both types of data and combine them, we have to go into 2 separate systems. So we might have our MES output where we're going in and gathering this data. We're going to our BI tool for a certain version of the report. But in Excel, we have to combine both of these. And if the MES had been installed with an ELT mindset, that raw data would have been getting dumped into a tool like Snowflake. Now, I don't want to bash on historical implementations. Over the past 10 years, we've seen a monumental reduction in the cost of data storage. And so this is why it's become much more feasible and therefore efficient to bring your raw data into your data warehouse so that you can start to do all of your reporting in one central place. So here in this imaginary future, we've switched to ELT, and inside of our BI tool, we can now access both our raw data as well as our aggregated report with all of the logic we need, developed by our analyst in SQL, so that we can transform this data however we need in a standard and reproducible way. So I put together some simplified diagrams to show what just happened, right? We've gone from a chain from users to system to database to BI tool to Excel, and we also had to do an off-branch Excel step. And now that we're getting all of this data into a central data warehouse, we see this much smoother and more flexible chain of data, right? We've reduced the requirement to go directly into the system for that raw data, and we're reducing a lot of the transformation logic required in Excel because we can do it all in our BI tools or in other transformation places just to get that raw data. So that was the storage and processing step, but we want to use this data. And like I said earlier, we really want to start with usage and work backwards. So now that we're thinking about ETL, ELT, let's think about how we're going to use that data. So we want to eventually put that route time data into Simio. And we have the target format. We know the numbers that we need to get. We just need to get it there. So we honestly have to walk all the way back and think about where that data is stored, which we've now set up to be stored in a little bit more of a useful way. We're going to think about how to process it so that we can use it in our preferred format. And so this brings us to our second demonstration, the data transformation layer. So when we left off our last demo, we had all the data we need in our business intelligence tool, but our analyst had written this series of SQL statements which transformed the data to our preferred format down here. And this is a really great place to be. However, we are in a situation where this logic that is so important to our business is living in the charting tool. And that is not, in my opinion, the place where critical business logic should live. Enter dbt. dbt is an amazing platform for transforming, documenting, testing, and orchestrating data. It's become tremendously popular in the data analyst community in the past 5 to 10 years. It is most notably a SQL-first transformation platform. So while it is an amazing tool and super powerful, it can be harder for less data-savvy users to get their head around. So while I am an advocate of the dbt platform, I am mainly using this tool to demonstrate its concepts, and I am not necessarily saying that every organization should use dbt for their data mesh. Again, we have this logic in our reporting tool separated out into a bunch of subqueries or subcomponents of logic. And we really want to do all of this processing in our data warehouse. We want our reporting tool to look like this when we're done. We just want a tool to go get everything from a nice curated data model for what we need. And this should be the same table that any BI tool uses. Any integration should just go to a nice, clean table. And that brings us to dbt, which is where we take that same SQL, we embed it into our transformation layer and orchestrate it in a proper sequence to gather and summarize our data warehouse into the specific tables that we need. So again, this is a code-based tool. but the ideas would be the same even if this was a drag and drop interface. We are taking data from this raw table down here in the bottom left. We are orchestrating it into a first layer table. So this isn't necessarily something that many people will ever look at, but it's separate, it's clean, it's testable, and these tables continue. They depend upon one another until we get to our final table, which is in a much cleaner, testable form of SQL. So we're both making a chain of our data as well as providing traceability to orchestrate and test these small chunks instead of having to use large scripts of logic. And the end result is that this table right here will get generated by dbt from all of its predecessor tables, and the output will be the exact same. But the benefit is that any system can use this exact same statement to get the exact same data. And that doesn't even get into all of the other benefits that we'll talk about with the dbt platform. So if we remember our diagram that we left off on, we had this chain from our system that was then being transformed in the report tool and then loaded into Excel. And now, after this addition of dbt, we are seeing a slightly modified, but so much more flexible chain of this data. Because with this tool, we are now transforming our data inside of the warehouse, meaning it can be used by any tool in any way, and it will always be the same, right? We don't need that BI tool anymore. We can actually connect Excel directly to the data transformation layer. We can even connect Simio to the data transformation layer. And this is the goal. This is what we want, so that for whatever reason, if we want to use all three tools connected to that data, we just have one central place to work on the logic, so that if things change or so that if we need to look up, we only have to look in one place. And this becomes a lot more important when your data chains start looking like this, right? When you have many systems involved and dozens of stakeholders and endpoints, dbt can be a foundational and central repository for all of your data logic. Now, again, dbt doesn't have to be the solution here. There are lots of platforms and more appearing every day. The main idea I want you to take away from this is the only place where business logic is being applied. So everything coming in from the systems is just raw table data. And everything going out to the reporting tools, to Excel, or to other applications is already prepared. There's no logic inside of any arrows other than the arrows that point to dbt. So I think I've hammered this enough. The main takeaway that I want you to have here is don't worry about centralizing your BI tool. A lot of companies are like, oh, we're using too many BI tools. That's not the problem. The problem is you're doing data transformation in 10 different places. And that makes it impossible for people to truly collaborate on data in a federated way. And another key note here, just watch out. A lot of, especially legacy systems, but even modern tools, Salesforce might have custom reports built into it. And while that can be useful and is certainly unavoidable, when you have logic built in Salesforce, you already start having two locations where business logic is being applied. Instead, I would encourage organizations to load the raw Salesforce data into their central store and do the transformation inside of a platform like dbt. However, if that's not possible, at the least, you should have good documentation about your Salesforce data in dbt, which is a perfect segue into my next point, the data catalog. So the final key piece of attaining this data mesh is having all of your data in a consistent place and then documenting alongside of it what you're doing along each step of the ride. So we're looking in the end at this fact route times by step by month table, and we see the output. But in the future, if people want to understand it, DBT now has a documentation portal where we can go in and find the description of this report to understand a high-level summary and a little bit about what it's used for, as well as we can look at each column in that report. So for example, these route time per order numbers, we can see it's in minutes. So even if that should have been made more clear from the column names, we have a place where we can document each column as well as see the source code for this table. But what's cool is when you break down your models into these chains, you can start to create lineage graphs to view the tables and the models that this report is dependent on. And you can even over time develop a complete chain of your data orchestration layer. So when I make changes to the dim ordered completions model, which I can view the documentation and read a little bit about it, but when I go back to that lineage graph, I can also see that if I make changes to this, it's going to impact other things. And over time, as you scale a data mesh or orchestrated data layer, your lineage map starts to look like this, and it becomes an incredibly useful tool to understand where all your data comes from, what's dependent on it, and what it's actually supposed to be calculating. So now that we've seen some technology that really makes working together with data a lot cleaner and more scalable, let's revisit these 4 tenets of data mesh. And I think this all starts to make a little bit more sense to help visualize how the future of data orchestration is going to be democratized. We see pretty clearly the way that these tools are going to enable individual domains to own and transform their data. Organizations and business units can now treat their data packages as a product, right? Other teams can depend on these through the DBT or an alternative dependency network, and they can easily see what's going on in other places in the business. People who are curious and hungry can go in and understand all different facets of an enterprise's data mesh, and it's all accessible, and you can implement controls, of course, to really understand and work with any data that you need. And this also enables more centralized teams to enforce or push certain best practices to be used throughout the organization. So everyone can sort of work together in this centralized location. Now, my final point revolves around this funny thing, which I think we're all kind of thinking about in the back of our heads as we go through these ideas, is like, yeah, how's that going to happen, right? You know, the data governance team can lead everyone to water, but we're busy and we don't have a ton of talented data individuals. So first off, it is going to take time, and it's going to require an organization to really understand and value these principles. But on the bright side, I think there's a word that might help. AI is here. AI is growing at an exponential rate in its capability. And I think it's going to have a big impact on these types of tools. And my example that I think everyone in the audience will remember is Mr. Clippy. I think that these data governance advisors will eventually be all around us, and it will enable and support a scalable data mesh without requiring too much time from the users. So AI will be able to do things like tell you when reports are duplicated and help you consolidate them. AI will be able to detect when you're doing something different from someone else. And this sort of background magic will create that federated vision of the data mesh. Here we see another great example on the governance side, where if a report's not being used, our system should be able to tell us and get rid of it. And there's so many other use cases in this specific field. I think data quality is a really important one, making sure that data comes in similar to how it did yesterday. And another facet of this is that it's easier than ever for individuals who maybe don't have a technical background to start learning more about data and even just understanding what's exposed to them. So obviously ChatGPT can be a great educational resource for someone trying to understand whether it's code or maybe even just a concept. And on the flip side, there's a lot of money and technology going into tools that allow you to take text and convert it into either code-based or no-code-based solutions to acquire data. So I expect more and more of this, and it all just kind of marries perfectly with this democratized future of the data mesh. And I think that's really the cherry on top that makes me believe this is the future of enterprise data. So I've talked a lot. I hope you've enjoyed. I want to leave with a few kind of summary points about what the future of data governance really looks like. And I've mentioned all of these, but I want to just emphasize one last time, centralizing the data transformation layer. No matter what the future of enterprise data looks like, this is an absolute guarantee. And I've talked about it a lot, so I'll leave it at that. Another thing, we all need to invest more in upskilling and enabling people to use data. At every facet of a business, there is more and more data being captured and more emphasis on the quality of that data. And regardless of whether you are implementing a data mesh tomorrow or not, every business should be thinking about ways to upskill and enable all of their employees, and AI can be a big part of that. Again, this is the type of thing that you have to start now, because if you don't, then your historical data is going to be a terrible mess. So you got to start thinking about data quality. You cannot train machine learning models if you don't have good, clean historical data. And this has to start soon, and it has to be done well, or else you will always sort of struggle to stay up to date with data technology. And lastly, I think everyone should take the conversation from today, think about it, and envision what a federated democracy looks like for your enterprise data. This is really the best pairing of words, whether you think you want to do a data mesh, data fabric, data whatever. This federated democracy is the only way that enterprises can truly use data correctly at scale. So I'm not saying I'm confident what that looks like, and it's going to depend from organization to organization, but strive to envision a world where people can collaborate with data and are incentivized to keep clean data to help each other. Everyone, thank you so much. This was my presentation on data mesh, a new mentality for enterprise data governance, and I hope you have a great day.